What if everything we believe we know about human origins is incomplete? What if the Sumerians, the first scribes in history, were not describing humans, but rather an older species, a people who walked the earth long before us? This is the forbidden question, the question that almost no one asks, but that silently echoes between the lines of the clay tablets found in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. Today, here at History for Sleep, we will cross that invisible border between myth and memory, between science and mystery, between what is taught and what has been carefully erased. Before we go any further, take a deep breath and allow yourself to imagine, what would it be like to discover that we were not the first intelligent experiment on this planet? What other species, perhaps more advanced, more ancient, more connected to the Sumerian gods, existed thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of years before Homo sapiens? There are archaeologists who would call this delusion. There are historians who would look away. But the Sumerians left records, symbols, impossible royal lists, chronologies that defy any evolutionary logic, and stories that don't fit into traditional narratives. And when you put all of this side by side, a new possibility begins to emerge, a possibility so disturbing that it could completely change what we understand as human history. Imagine a pre-human civilization described in enigmatic detail by ancient scribes, creatures that weren't gods, but weren't men either, beings with unusual physical characteristics, rituals that predate any known religion, and knowledge that seem much greater than should have existed in such a remote time. Was it just a myth, a metaphor? Or would it be a fragment of something real that has survived time, written by hands that saw more than they dared to explain? There are Sumerian records that speak of first beings, entities shaped before humanity, beings that coexisted with figures associated with the Anunnaki. There are lists of kings who ruled for thousands of years, as if another biology, another life cycle, and another type of body existed in that forgotten era. What if these descriptions are not poetic exaggerations, but rather direct testimonies of something that actually inhabited the earth? This video is not about accepting ready-made beliefs. It's about exploring the forbidden, revisiting the clay tablets with different eyes, investigating symbols, names, lineages, and stories that were treated as mere allegories, but that perhaps are clues to a lost ancestral species. A species older than human beings, documented by the Sumerians as if their existence were natural, part of everyday life, part of the living memory of the oldest people in civilization. And if this species really existed, why did it disappear? Would it have been extinguished by a cataclysm, for wars, through the intervention of the Anunnaki themselves? Or was it simply replaced by humanity as the result of a larger genetic experiment, an experiment that many Sumerian texts seem to describe bluntly? As we delve into this mystery, I want you to notice every detail, every word, every image that these ancient narratives offer us. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore the questions that arise. And in the end, perhaps the biggest revelation isn't about who they were, but about who we really are. And now that this door has been opened, we need to walk inside it even more deeply, exploring exactly what the Sumerians left recorded about these beings and why these descriptions continue to haunt us to this day. And as we move deeper into this mystery, there is something essential that I need you to do with me. This kind of investigation into species that predate humans, hidden Sumerian records, tablets that defy history, only gains momentum when more people get involved, when more curious minds come together to question and interpret these lost pieces of the past. So, before we move on, I want you to leave in the comments what has caught your attention the most so far. Your perception, your doubt, or even your theory can open paths that we have not yet explored. Each comment helps build this collective investigation and strengthens this community that searches for truths that time has tried to bury. And if this content is making you think, reflect, and see possibilities that you never imagined, then it is essential that you leave a like. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it shows the platform that this type of theme, forbidden history, ancient mysteries, forgotten species, deserves to be delivered to more people. This is how we keep this type of narrative alive that almost no one has the courage to discuss. And of course, if you're new here or if you already follow the channel but haven't subscribed yet, this is the ideal time. When you sign up and activate the bell, you guarantee that you will receive each new episode of this deep journey about Sumerians, Anunnaki, lost eras and secrets buried in the dust of antiquity. That's how you don't miss any details, any revelations, any dots that might connect everything we're exploring today. So as we prepare to dive even deeper into the next part, where we will analyze more precisely what exactly the Sumerians recorded about this possible pre-human species, take the opportunity to leave your comment, like and subscribe. This shows that you are truly committed to the search for occult knowledge and helps keep this investigation alive that challenges the boundaries of traditional history. Now, with that said, we can move on, because what comes next could completely change the way you understand the Sumerian records. From this point on, we delve deeper into the first clues left by the Sumerians, and the more we analyze these clay fragments, the more evident it becomes that perhaps they were not simply recording myths or metaphors, but rather describing something that was part of the everyday memory of a people who observed the world with eyes completely different from ours. When you look at these tablets up close, you realize that they don't try to explain the world. They assume that the world was already known in a way that we, thousands of years later, can no longer understand. It is as if the Sumerians were handing us an incomplete puzzle, with pieces that do not fit into the traditional evolutionary narrative, especially when they talk about first beings, creatures that existed before humans, beings that had consciousness, purpose, and even social structures of their own. It's not just poetic, it's descriptive, and that difference changes everything. Imagine the scene. A Sumerian scribe sitting in front of a damp tablet, precisely marking each symbol, unaware that millennia later someone would try to decipher it as if it were fiction. He did not see himself as the author of a legend. He saw himself as a recorder of reality, a reality that included beings whose existence predated Homo sapiens. And when we look carefully at this material, we notice patterns, descriptions of unusual height, body proportions that don't match humans, references to motor and cognitive abilities different from our own, and even mentions of behaviors that seem more ritual than instinctive. It's as if this pre-human species had a culture, a structure, an organization. And that, in itself, challenges everything we've learned about anthropology. Another intriguing point is that the Sumerians did not present these beings as monsters or aberrations. The way they are described is almost respectful, as if they were ancestors, predecessors, or perhaps even legitimate inhabitants of Earth before the arrival of humanity. This is extremely significant because it suggests that the Sumerian people did not see themselves as the beginning of history, but as part of a much longer continuity, connected to previous eras erased by successive cataclysms and rebirths. And when we combine this with accounts of the Anunnaki, beings who would have guided, governed, or interfered in civilizational cycles, we begin to realize that perhaps the stories that survive are not fabrications, but distorted memories of real events. Now think about it with me. Why would these scribes go to so much effort to record creatures that didn't exist? Why devote space, time, and skill to engraving in stone something purely imaginary when they were trying to catalogue kings, events, temples, transactions, and genealogies? It doesn't make sense for a people with such practical priorities. Writing emerged to record what was important, not to invent what was fantasy. This makes each description of a possible pre-human species even more relevant, especially when it appears in repetitive patterns. The repetition on the tablets suggests that these creatures were known, remembered, perhaps even feared or revered. And there is another detail that many ignore: time. The Sumerians spoke of very long eras, of reigns that lasted thousands of years, of lineages that preceded humanity by impossible margins. For traditional academia, this is just mythological exaggeration. But what if these chronologies are symbolic of something else? If they represent not human reigns, but cycles of species? If these thousands of years are actually the duration of this ancient race's presence on Earth? When we face these possibilities, the scenario is completely transformed, and what seemed like just a myth takes on much more concrete contours. And as we dismantle this conventional narrative, we begin to see subtle connections. Repeated symbols, shifting linguistic patterns, allusions to transitions between species, abrupt changes in character, and cycle, references to cataclysms that erased entire eras. The very idea of before the flood takes on a new dimension. Perhaps the flood did not just erase human cities, but rather the last traces of the previous species. This would explain why the Sumerians speak of this era as a completely different world from what came later, because it really was. It is also important to note the silence. There are entire sections of the tablets that appear truncated, as if information is missing or as if the scribes were instructed to omit specific parts. On some broken tablets, we can see the beginnings of physical descriptions, but the rest are lost forever. In others, there are lists of eras that end abruptly, as if the transition between one species and another were something forbidden to be detailed. And this absence speaks as loudly as the records that survive. The gap, what was not said, often reveals more than what is written. And as you continue to imagine all of this, you realize that this investigation is not about proving that a pre-human species actually existed, but about allowing the question to exist. Allow the mystery to breathe, the impossible to be considered, the forbidden story to be explored with curiosity and courage. Because increasingly, the modern world discovers clues to lost civilizations, misplaced artifacts, dates that don't make sense, archaeological disconnections that defy the traditional narrative. And all these pieces, added to the Sumerian records, point in the same direction. There was something before us, something that wasn't human, something that time tried to erase, but that Sumerian writing preserved, even if in a fragmented form. And while you reflect on this, I want you to leave a word in the comments that defines how you feel when imagining this possibility. It can be mystery, truth, forbidden, or even awakening. Your interaction helps bring more people to this investigation and keeps this type of content alive, which the platform rarely recommends on its own. Let's continue together uncovering what the Sumerians really knew. When we continue analyzing these Sumerian records in light of everything we have already discussed, something begins to become even more evident. The deeper you delve, the more you realize that these tablets are not just historical documents, but doors to another perception of time, origin, and existence. And this is where we start to get into the most intriguing part, the one that many archaeologists prefer to ignore, because it doesn't fit into any traditional narrative. We are talking about symbols, linguistic structures, and entire passages that seem to have been written to describe not just events, but to witness the transition between eras. It is as if the Sumerians lived on the threshold of two worlds, the world they inherited from an ancestral species and the world that would be formed from humanity. And they knew it. When we look at the Sumerian descriptions with this deeper understanding, we notice a kind of subtle contrast between two types of beings. Those they describe as human, with recognizable characteristics, and others, mentioned in older passages, who carry completely different attributes. There are indirect mentions of more elongated bodies, less rigid movements, unusual physical capabilities, and even expressions that suggest an almost spiritual connection with natural forces. It is as if this pre-human species was seen not as an inferior or primitive race, but as part of an older lineage, perhaps even closer to the so-called gods, the Anunnaki. This opens up a range of interpretations that go far beyond conventional archaeology. After all, if all these references are taken seriously, humanity would not have started from scratch. It would have started from a transition, a breaking point between a world that already existed and another that was just being born. And when you think about it, an inevitable question arises. What would have happened for this species to disappear so completely? Because everything that the Sumerians recorded, whether directly, symbolically, or fragmentarily, suggests that these beings existed, coexisted with greater forces, perhaps with the Anunnaki themselves, and were then erased. There were no fossils left, no cities left, no tools left, just echoes on clay tablets. This total disappearance indicates, almost without a shadow of a doubt, some kind of catastrophic event, something that completely redefined the planet. And this aligns strangely with what the Sumerians called new beginnings, pre-flood eras that ended abruptly and almost completely. These cycles were not described as mere cultural changes, but as complete extinctions. And within these extinctions, the traces of this pre-human species would have been lost forever. At the same time, there are indications that certain knowledge entities were preserved. The Sumerians, by recording information about advanced agriculture, precise astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and complex rituals, demonstrate an understanding of the world that does not match the evolutionary state that historians attribute to them. It is as if they had inherited a package of ready-made knowledge, as if someone, or some species, had transmitted knowledge accumulated over previous eras. And when you combine that with the idea that perhaps these first beings were not just ancient inhabitants, but bearers of deep knowledge, the narrative changes completely. Rather than just existing before humans, this species may have played a crucial role in the formation of what we know as civilization. And here we enter another layer of this mystery: symbols. In several Sumerian tablets, especially the oldest ones, we find geometric patterns, repetitive shapes, combinations of lines and curves that, at first glance, seem like mere aesthetic elements. But, when analyzed carefully, these symbols appear to have an informative function. They describe celestial movements, natural cycles, transitions between eras and, in some cases, appear to represent forms of beings that are not human. Elongated shapes, larger heads, different proportions. Drawings that, if they were found in prehistoric caves, would be classified as symbolic cave art, but on Sumerian tablets they are simply ignored. Isn't it curious how academia chooses what to consider relevant and what to discard? And while we observe these symbols, another even more disturbing detail emerges: coexistence. In some Sumerian narratives, there are times when humans and these earlier beings appear to inhabit the same world for a short period, almost as if one species were replacing the other, but still sharing the same geographic space. This overlap makes sense if we consider that the emergence of humans, especially if it involved genetic manipulation, as some texts imply, would have been a process, not an instantaneous event. This explains why certain passages describe interaction, conflict, cooperation, and even teachings given by older beings to newly created humans. This would also explain why nascent humanity had such advanced cultural and technological capabilities, because it learned from those who came before. And this theory becomes even stronger when we look at the way the Sumerians describe the Anunnaki. In many narratives, the Anunnaki are portrayed not just as gods, but as figures who govern, intervene, and make decisions about the fate of the species. If we interpret this literally, The Anunnaki may have played a crucial role in the transition between a pre-human species and modern humanity, perhaps even choosing which characteristics should prevail. This suggests that the Sumerians were not just recording history. They were trying to explain their own existence through fragments of inherited memories, stories passed down by survivors, or instructions left by this ancient species. And this completely changes the way we understand the history of civilization. Now, while you absorb all of this, I want you to leave a word in the comments that describes how you feel when you imagine that humans were not the first intelligent species on Earth. It could be something like origin, ancestor, mystery, or awakening. This interaction helps the channel reach even more people seeking this same journey through hidden truths and forbidden stories. Let's keep moving forward together as we uncover what truly existed before humanity. As we delve into this enigma that the Sumerians left engraved on their clay tablets, we begin to realize that these descriptions do not appear in isolation. They appear in layers, as if the story itself were superimposed, and each generation had recorded fragments of something that had already been told long before them. This becomes even more evident when we observe how the Sumerians described the environment, ancient cities, and the earth itself in eras that precede humanity. These are not vague or mythological descriptions. They are structured reports with details that seem to point to the existence of an organized civilization even before the first human being. It is as if the pre-human world had left marks so deep that even the first human civilizations could still feel them, like persistent echoes crossing time. The Sumerians spoke of ancient landscapes that no longer exist today, regions that would have been destroyed by cataclysms or transformed through immense natural cycles. And in these scenarios, we find mentions of creatures that do not fit the human profile. They describe beings with different proportions, expressions that do not correspond to the common human face, behaviors that resemble they boast both intelligence and ritualism, suggesting that this pre-human species not only existed, but structured its own form of society. The way they moved, how they interacted with the environment, and how they were represented shows that they were seen as part of an earlier world, perhaps more subtle, more connected to what the Sumerians called the order of the gods. And the more we analyze these passages, the more we realize that the Sumerians were not simply trying to explain these beings. They recognized them. This changes everything, because it shows that humanity did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged within a context that had perhaps been prepared, shaped, or even abandoned by this pre-human species. It's as if we inherited an Earth that already had history, culture, and perhaps even technology, a technology that disappeared before we could understand it. And this perception, however uncomfortable it may be, meets several patterns that we find in the modern world: inexplicable megalithic structures, advanced knowledge emerging out of nowhere, and legends of people who received instructions from ancient beings. When observing the Sumerian narratives about the Anunnaki, we realize that they are described as direct participants in the history of the species. And this opens up an even deeper line of reasoning. If the Anunnaki arrived on this planet and found an already existing pre-human species, what led them to modify it, replace it, or create something new? There are excerpts that suggest that humans were shaped through a process of intervention, almost as an attempt at adaptation or continuity. And this may indicate that this ancient species was not suitable for the purposes of the Anunnaki, or had simply reached the end of its natural cycle. Whatever the explanation, the Sumerians made it clear that there was a before, a during, and an after. And this before is the most ignored point in human history, because if there was an intelligent species before us, then everything changes. Our origin, our identity, our relationship with the planet, and even the way we interpret the past. And the Sumerians, with their almost scientific precision, may have been the last witnesses, even if indirect, of these beings. Not because they lived with them physically, but because they inherited their stories, their symbols, their fears, and the distorted memories of an ancient time. Think about the recurring patterns of lost civilizations that appear in cultures separated by oceans. There is always an earlier, more advanced people who mysteriously disappeared. This can't just be cultural coincidence. It's memory. This point becomes even more evident when we analyze the narrative structure of the Sumerian tablets. In many of them, older events are always described in a more serious and direct way, as if they were memories preserved by tradition, while more recent events take on more human, more relatable contours. This tonal difference suggests that there was a clear distinction between what the Sumerians knew through direct experience and what they learned through ancestral transmission. And within this transmission, stories about pre-human beings appear as something sacred, almost untouchable, as if they belonged to a forbidden domain that few dared to question. And here arises a possibility that, although uncomfortable, is impossible to ignore. What if the Sumerians were merely recording fragments of what remained of a much older species, whose ruins, artifacts and tracks were completely destroyed in some cataclysmic event? This would explain why we haven't found direct archaeological evidence of this civilization, because the natural world, climate cycles, tectonic shifts, and time itself would have erased everything. But the symbolic memory remained, and this memory was recorded by the Sumerians not to create myths, but to preserve what they knew about the world that came before them. In certain passages, there is a clear suggestion that the transition between this ancient species and humans was not peaceful. There are descriptions of conflicts, disputes, divisions, and, above all, divine judgments, events that may have been reinterpreted as mythical wars between gods, when in fact they may have been clashes between species, between different life forms fighting for space, survival, or control. This connects directly to narratives of mass destruction, flood, fire, devastating storms, and recreations of humanity. All of this seems to indicate that the change between species was drastic, rapid, and possibly forced. And as we put these pieces together, the feeling is that we are getting closer to something that official history prefers not to address. The idea that we are just the most recent version of a process much longer, more complex, and more hidden than we imagine. The weight of this revelation is enormous, because it touches on profound questions about what we are and why we are here. And when we look back at these ancient tablets, we feel as if we are being invited to look beyond the veil, beyond what history has allowed to survive. And while you think about it, I want you to leave in the comments the word that best defines your reaction so far. Maybe ancestor, forbidden, memory, or even another species. This interaction helps expand the investigation and strengthen our community of seekers of hidden truth. Let's keep moving forward together as we reveal what else the Sumerians hid about the species that existed before humanity. As we delve deeper into this forgotten narrative that the Sumerians preserved, we realize that the central question is not just whether this pre-human species existed, but when it lived, and how its presence shaped the world that the first humans encountered. And this is where the hidden timeline theme comes into its own. Because unlike modern history, which organizes the past into simple linear layers, the Sumerians describe the Earth as a stage for successive eras, each marked by different species, different rulers, and different cataclysms. They didn't think about the past the way we do today. For them, time was cyclical, alive, full of dramatic restarts. And within these restarts, this ancient species appears as a silent protagonist, like a previous chapter that still echoes in the world's memory. Sumerian king lists, for example, suggest impossibly long reigns, thousands of years for a single ruler, something that makes no sense if we apply ordinary human biology. But when we interpret this as traces of a previous species, With unusual longevity or even a different physical structure, these durations begin to take on another meaning. Perhaps these kings were not human. Perhaps they were members of this pre-human species who ruled vast territories with capabilities that we today seem incapable of understanding. And this possibility puts into perspective all the Sumerian narratives about eras before the flood, as if this were the final milestone in the extinction of the ancient species and the definitive beginning of humanity. The most fascinating thing is that these descriptions are never treated as fantasy. The Sumerians presented these eras as a legitimate part of history. For them, the world did not begin with the first human, but with previous beings who had their own logic, their own structure, and even their own way of relating to the so-called gods. This leads us to another disturbing reflection. What if the Sumerians were not just reporting what they knew, but preserving what they inherited from these beings? Knowledge about astronomy, agriculture, metallurgy, the natural rhythms of the earth, all of this appears abruptly in the Sumerian civilization, as if it had come from somewhere earlier. It's as if this pre-human species left a legacy, intentionally or not, that early humans simply continued. And when we think about the ages leading up to the flood, we cannot ignore the fact that almost every ancient culture describes a great global cataclysm that erased entire civilizations. The Sumerians were particularly detailed in this regard, describing a previous world that had been destroyed by forces that surpassed any human understanding. Some texts speak of waters that rose against the earth, others mention winds of destruction, and some even suggest battles between beings that today we would interpret as mythological. But if we look at it with less skeptical and more analytical eyes, we begin to realize that these narratives may be distorted descriptions of real events. Extreme climate change, massive eruptions, continental shifts, or even wars between species. What if this pre-human species had become extinct not because of weakness, but as a result of something much greater, something that the Sumerians tried to describe in the only way they knew how, through metaphors, symbols, and stories passed down from generation to generation. And in doing so, they preserved the memory of a time before humanity, a time when the earth was inhabited by different beings, perhaps more advanced or better adapted to the pre-flood world. When we look at these accounts through this lens, we begin to realize that humanity is not the first chapter in Earth's history, but only the most recent. Another fascinating point is how the Sumerians describe sudden changes in the sky, as if astronomical phenomena had played a significant role in the transition between one species and another. They speak of stars that moved from their places, of lights that were not of this world, and of celestial cycles that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. This raises the possibility that these astronomical events, perhaps approximations of celestial bodies, changes in the Earth's orbit or gravitational changes, were responsible for creating the conditions that led this ancient species to extinction. And if this is true, then the emergence of humans was not a fluke, but part of a natural or directed process of replacement. This view connects directly to the concept of ancestral memory, something the Sumerians seemed to value deeply. They believed that the past did not die. It remained on Earth, in symbols, in cycles, in places, and even in people. When they spoke of earlier ages, they were not trying to reconstruct something distant and inaccessible. They were reporting what was still part of their identity, and if that identity included memories of a pre-human species, then it is possible that fragments of that memory have survived to this day, hidden in our legends, myths, children's stories, and even the collective dreams of humanity. And the more we look at this past, the more we realize that the extinction of this species did not mean the end of its influence. The Sumerians spoke of ancient teachings, of knowledge that did not originate with them, but was handed down to them. This suggests that before disappearing, this species left some form of record, some kind of wisdom that early humans received, absorbed, and transformed. And this would explain why such ancient civilizations seem to have started at an advanced level of knowledge. They weren't starting from scratch, they were continuing something much older. And while you reflect on this, I want you to leave a word in the comments that captures what you think of this possibility. Something like lost era, previous civilization, hidden memory, or forgotten time. This not only helps the channel reach more people, but also strengthens our community of seekers of forbidden truth. Let's continue together, because there is much more about this pre-human species that the Sumerians still have to reveal. As we progress through this labyrinth of Sumerian stories and fragments of ancestral memory, we inevitably come to a delicate point, perhaps the most controversial of this entire line of investigation. The possibility that the Anunnaki not only interacted with this pre-human species, but that they profoundly influenced their existence and perhaps even determined their end. Sumerian texts, when analyzed without the filter of modern interpretation, seem to indicate that there was a direct relationship between the so-called gods and these ancient beings. And it's not just occasional intervention, it is about coexistence, observation, evaluation, and in many cases, judgment. This raises a question that echoes like thunder behind all these narratives. What if the Anunnaki saw this pre-human species as a first experiment, a prototype, an initial step towards something much bigger? When we look at stories about the creation of humanity, we realize that nothing in them suggests spontaneity or chance. On the contrary, everything seems carefully planned. The Sumerians speak of modeling, of improvement, of mixing, of seeds of the gods being placed on earth. These terms, however metaphorical they may seem, carry enormous symbolic weight, especially if we consider that the Sumerians had no interest in random poetry when recording events on their official tablets. And this leads us to think that humanity, from their point of view, was not a natural evolution, but a deliberate creation, a creation that perhaps completely replaced the previous species. But why replace? This is the question that starts to bother you, because if previous beings already inhabited the earth and had their own form of intelligence, what would justify their removal from the scene? Perhaps this pre-human species was not suited to the Anunnaki's goals. Perhaps he was unstable, difficult to control, or simply incapable of performing tasks that these gods considered essential. It is even possible that this species had its own will, its own culture, its own understanding of life, and that this came into conflict with what the Anunnaki wanted to implement. And if this is true, the extinction of the previous species would not have been an accident, it would have been a choice. There are Sumerian excerpts that mention cleansing, purifications, new beginnings, and these words, when seen in the light of an external intervention, take on another meaning. We no longer talk about natural phenomena, but about targeted actions, and this brings us to the possibility that the flood, or something equivalent, was the final tool used to eliminate what was left of this pre-human species. A brutal, definitive tool that eradicated an entire lineage to make room for the emergence of another. Humans, created later, would have been shaped to better adapt to the needs of these super beings, rivers. And this idea, as uncomfortable as it is powerful, appears repeatedly in Sumerian tablets, albeit in symbolic form. Another important point is that the Sumerians described these interactions with the Anunnaki in an extremely concrete, almost administrative way. They spoke of divisions of territory, of direct instructions, of the founding of cities, of the designation of functions. If we interpret this literally, we realize that these beings were not just spiritual figures, they were real rulers with specific objectives, their own social structures, and very clear methods. This reinforces the idea that human creation was not motivated by benevolence or curiosity, but by necessity. Humanity would then be a project a project that replaced another. Even more intriguing is observing how the Sumerians speak of the mixture of essences, the union of something that already existed on Earth with something coming from the heavens. This suggests a process of genetic modification, as if the Anunnaki had taken elements of the pre-human species and adapted, reorganized, enhanced, or simplified them to create something new. This would explain why some ancient narratives speak of humans as mixed children, balanced beings, or hybrid creations. Perhaps the previous species was too strong, too resilient, too conscious to fit into the plans of the Anunnaki. Perhaps it had its own spiritual vision, its own technology, or even its own relationship to the cosmos, something that could not coexist with the new ruler's agenda. And if we analyze all these pieces as a set, something starts to make sense. The pre-human species, despite being ancient and perhaps advanced, did not align with the purpose of the Anunnaki. This would have led to a conflict, not necessarily physical, but ideological, energetic, spiritual. And when two very different forces come into conflict, the more powerful one usually prevails. Thus, the Anunnaki would have ended the era of this species and started the human era, molding us as they deemed appropriate, erasing much of what existed before and implementing a new cycle of development. But the most impressive thing is that despite all this erasure, fragments of the previous species survived, not physically, but in the memory, in symbols, in traditions, in fears, and even in the myths of humanity. This explains why so many cultures speak of first beings, giants, ancient masters, luminous creatures, or pre-human shadows who dominated the earth before humans. These stories are echoes, distortions, confused memories of something that really existed, something the Sumerians recorded before it was completely forgotten. And while you reflect on this, on the real possibility that humanity emerged not as evolution, but as replacement, leave a word in the comments that summarizes what you feel when imagining this. Something like impact, control, origins, or manipulation. These interactions strengthen our community and keep alive this search for truths that history preferred to hide. Let's follow along, because the next part reveals even more about this forbidden transition between species. As we continue to delve deeper into this ancient puzzle, we begin to find a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore. The way traditional history insists on filling in gaps with silence, while the Sumerians, on the contrary, seem determined to record everything they witnessed, including what they did not fully understand. Modern archaeologists classify these excerpts as mythology, but when we look at the descriptions with an open mind and connect each detail to the possibility of a pre-human species, we realize that these tablets reveal much more than meets the eye. And it is at this point that we enter the issue of indirect evidence, that which is hidden in details that academia insists on ignoring. Linguistic patterns, sudden changes in the structure of writing, symbols that abruptly disappear from one era to another, and even objects described in ancient texts that do not correspond to anything from the human era. The Sumerians had a curious habit. When something was considered dangerous, forbidden, or incomprehensible, they did not delete it. They just moved it to the corners of the narratives, as if they were preserving a secret that could not be openly explained. And when we look closely at these excerpts, we realize that many of them are direct references to previous beings, to creatures that walked before human creation, and to life forms that had capabilities that today would seem almost supernatural. These creatures were not represented as monsters, but as important figures, some respected, others feared. This indicates that for the Sumerians, the pre-human species was not a myth. It was part of the historical reality that they inherited, part of an ancient tradition that did not exist. I would just hate to be erased. And when we look at Sumerian writing systems, we notice another fascinating clue. Some of the oldest words, especially on tablets dealing with pre-flood eras, have no direct equivalent in human language. They seem to describe concepts, functions, or social positions that do not make sense if attributed to humans. This suggests that the Sumerians were recording characteristics of beings that had another type of organization, another biology, another way of relating to the environment. It is as if the scribes were trying to translate something that came from a time that they themselves did not fully understand, something inherited, passed down through oral histories, through secret traditions, or perhaps even through survivors who witnessed the end of their species. This layer of ancestral memory becomes even more evident when we analyze the visual representations left by the Sumerians. There are figures with elongated skulls, disproportionate bodies, larger hands, narrower eyes, and, in some cases, beings represented with characteristics that do not align with any known human species. The conventional explanation is that these representations are artistic stylizations. But this justification falls apart when we realize that these same figures appear in different regions and eras, always associated with stories from the time before humans. The consistency of these images indicates continuity, not imagination, and adding this to the repetitive references on the tablets, we begin to draw a concrete portrait of the previous species, a race that lived in a different world, that witnessed events that the Sumerians only narrated as distant echoes, and that left deep marks on the culture, symbols, and spirituality of nascent humanity. Another detail that cannot be ignored are the objects mentioned on pre-flood tablets, instruments, artifacts, and structures described accurately, but which do not correspond to any known human object. Some look like mechanisms, others look like tools. Some even seem to have an energetic or ritualistic function. It is possible that these objects were part of the daily life of the pre-human species, and that the Sumerians, upon finding their remains after the cataclysm, tried to interpret them with the words and concepts they had. This would explain why some texts sound so confusing to us. They weren't describing something human. They were trying to translate remains of a civilization that wasn't theirs, and this point leads us to a deep reflection on forbidden archaeology. How many artifacts have been found and simply catalogued as functionless, ornamental, or even discarded, simply because they did not belong to any known human culture? How many physical remains of this pre-human species may have been ignored because they did not fit into traditional narratives? History tends to protect its own conventions, and anything that threatens to dismantle the standard evolutionary model is usually classified as an anomaly. But the Sumerians did not rule out these anomalies. They recorded them, and these records show that there was something before us, something that left traces strong enough to shape even the thinking of the first great human civilization. This is where we start to notice the scariest pattern of all: sudden silence. At a certain point in the Sumerian tablets, mentions of these beings simply disappear. Not gradually, they disappear as if someone had decided that the story could no longer be told. This may indicate that there was an imposition, a forced cultural change, or even a religious decree prohibiting that knowledge from being transmitted. And this abrupt break is perhaps the greatest evidence that the pre-human species actually existed, because erasure is only necessary when something very real still occupies space in the collective memory. But the most fascinating thing is that, even after this erasure, characteristics of this species continued to be present in Sumerian traditions. Certain deities, certain archetypes, certain symbols seem to carry traces of those ancient beings, as if they were reinterpreted to fit within the new human narrative created by the Anunnaki. This suggests that this pre-human species did not disappear completely. It turned into myth, into gods, into monsters, into sacred figures. And in doing so, she found a way to survive within the human psyche, even after physical destruction. And now, as you think about all of this, about symbols that shouldn't exist, words that don't belong to humanity, artifacts that don't fit into any human culture, and the sudden removal of information that clearly was important, I want you to leave a word in the comments that represents what you believe is happening here. It could be something like evidence, erasure, hidden truth, or pre-human. This helps strengthen our community and allows more seekers to reach this content and awaken to what the Sumerians really tried to preserve. Let's continue together, because there is still much more to reveal about this species that existed before humanity. As we delve deeper into the forbidden history that the Sumerians left carefully fragmented on their tablets, we arrive at a key point that many traditional scholars avoid: the mysterious extinction of this pre-human species. It is as if all the paths, all the clues, all the enigmatic references converged on a single event. An event so gigantic, so devastating, so completely transformative that it erased not only bodies and civilizations, but also all direct memory of these beings. And yet some of that memory survived, hidden in symbols, metaphors, and narratives that the Sumerians tried to preserve even without fully understanding what they were recording. The question that hangs in the air, then, is inevitable. What really happened to this species before humanity? The Sumerians speak of cataclysms as if they were cyclical events, a natural part of Earth's history. But when we analyze these texts carefully, we realize that they treat the specific cataclysm that ended the pre-human era very differently. There is a greater intensity, a sense of loss, of rupture, of forced transition. They describe waters that swallowed entire lands, winds that ripped trees from the ground, fire that fell from the sky, and days when the sun itself seemed to disappear. These descriptions, although poetic, may represent real events, perhaps multiple cataclysms occurring in sequence. Abrupt climate changes, colossal volcanic eruptions, cosmic impacts, shifting tectonic plates. The repetition of this pattern in cultures around the world leaves no room for doubt. Something gigantic has happened, but the difference is in the details. In several Sumerian tablets, there are descriptions that do not seem to refer to the destruction of human cities. After all, humanity did not yet dominate the world at that time, but rather to the destruction of non-human environments. Mountains mentioned in older texts simply no longer exist. Entire regions described as prosperous have become permanent deserts, and creatures represented in the first narratives disappear completely after this event. This suggests that the cataclysm not only destroyed a physical world, but also the entire ecosystem in which this pre-human species lived. If they depended on certain environmental conditions, temperatures, resources, weather patterns, the abrupt change of those conditions would have been enough to wipe them out of existence. And if we think that this species had its own form of culture and technology, the impact would have been even more devastating. Imagine entire civilizations being destroyed, cities buried under water or ash, accumulated knowledge being lost in a matter of days. For us modern humans, this is difficult to visualize, but the Sumerians, who inherited the memory of this trauma through generations, tried to preserve it the only way they could, by turning stories into warnings. And that is why so many Sumerian texts emphasize the fragility of eras, the impermanence of civilizations, and the need to respect cosmic cycles. But beyond environmental destruction, there is the even more disturbing possibility that the demise of this species was influenced by external forces, perhaps even by the Anunnaki themselves. Many sections of the tablets mention decisions made by those who rule from heaven, decisions that involved terminating experiments, cleaning the surface, opening the way for new forms of life. As symbolic as all this may seem, we cannot ignore the fact that these words carry direct implications. If the Anunnaki had interests on Earth, specific goals, and if this pre-human species did not fit into the plans, then the final cataclysm may have been less of an accident and more of a deliberate event. Something that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, the human era. This would explain why, after the cataclysm, the Sumerians began to record the presence of the Anunnaki more frequently, as if these beings had taken a more active role in reorganizing the world. This would also explain why humanity appears shortly after this event, suddenly, with capabilities and knowledge that would seem impossible for a newly born civilization. Perhaps humanity has been prepared, shaped, adjusted to survive on a post-catastrophe planet. Perhaps this new form of life would be more adaptable, more controllable, more suited to the purposes of the beings they now ruled. There is also evidence that this pre-human species tried to resist the cataclysm, or at least us survive it. Some texts speak of refuges, hidden cities, protected places under the earth. This suggests that part of this species may have tried to shelter itself or even preserve its own culture. But if they survived, their genetic line never reappeared in visible form in human history. This leads us to two possibilities. Either they were completely extinct even after attempts at resistance, or there are still fragments, traces, unnoticed traces of these people somewhere on the planet. Perhaps in deep caves, unexplored regions or myths that we still don't understand. And when we look at the way the Sumerians describe the post-cataclysm world, we notice another important clue. They speak of a completely transformed planet. The rivers changed course, the stars seemed to rearrange themselves in the sky, and even the behavior of the winds and seasons changed. This indicates that the cataclysm was profound enough to redefine geography, climate, the agricultural cycle, and even the sky visible to humanity. And if this event was so radical, it is not surprising that an entire species disappeared without leaving a significant physical trace. But perhaps the most curious thing is that the Sumerians never speak of this disappearance as an end, but rather as a transition. For them, the world did not end. It changed guardians, inhabitants, purpose. And this concept of transition is fundamental because it shows us how they saw history as an endless cycle of rises and falls where each species plays a role before being replaced. This echoes disquietingly in their descriptions of pre-human beings, as if they knew that one day even humanity might occupy just one chapter of this long earthly history and not its final destination. And now, while you absorb all of this, cataclysms, extinctions, cosmic interventions, the silent disappearance of an entire species, I want you to leave a word in the comments that reflects how you feel when imagining the end of these ancient beings. Something like transition, fall, mystery, or even disappearance. Your interaction helps this content reach more people and keeps this investigation into Earth's forgotten eras alive. Let's move forward together, because what comes next reveals even more about the secrets the Sumerians tried to preserve. When we move to the most sensitive part of this entire Sumerian investigation, we realize that there is an element that always returns, like a persistent shadow behind all narratives. The feeling that something has been deliberately hidden, not just forgotten by time, not just erased by cataclysms, but hidden by humanity itself, or by those who shaped it. Something so profound, so disturbing, so transformative, that simply could not be conveyed freely. And it is at this point that we begin to realize why the history of the pre-human species became a taboo, a forbidden topic, restricted knowledge. The question is no longer, what happened to them? The question becomes, who decided that we shouldn't know they existed? This perception becomes even more evident when we analyze the transition between the pre-diluvial eras and the emergence of post-cataclysm Sumerian archives. There is an uncomfortable silence, a purposeful void between these two periods. The narratives become more careful, more symbolic, as if the scribes knew that certain stories could only be told through metaphors. They weren't just recording facts, were protecting information. They were carrying out an order or preserving a secret beyond their own understanding. And this brings us to the unsettling possibility that the erasure of the pre-human species was not just a natural or cosmic event, but a strategic decision. Sumerian texts repeatedly mention higher entities who ordained oblivion, who determined new beginnings, who sealed ancient knowledge. And although these terms seem poetic, they hide something much more literal. If the Anunnaki truly intervened in human creation and the redesign of the planet after the cataclysm, then it makes sense that they also controlled which stories should survive. A newly created or newly shaped humanity could not carry the weight of the existence of an older species, perhaps more advanced or even closer to the gods themselves. This would create instability, revolt, dangerous questions, unwanted comparisons. Thus, erasing the previous species would be as important as creating the new one. But total erasure was not possible. Fragments have survived, legends survived, symbols survived, and above all, the Sumerian tablets have survived, with subtle clues, with scattered traces, with encrypted memories that only reveal themselves when we analyze the complete set. The ancient truth still breathes between the cracks of these boards, as if refusing to be silenced completely. And this is the most fascinating point of the entire investigation. The truth always leaves traces, even when they try to hide it. The pre-human species didn't just disappear from Earth. It has disappeared from official discourse, from the historical narrative, from education, from science, but it continues to live between the lines of the oldest known civilization. With each step of this analysis, it becomes clearer that there was a systematic effort to rewrite history. The pre-flood eras are treated as mythology. Long reigns are interpreted as exaggerations. Non-human figures are classified as symbolic art. Anomalous descriptions are ignored, and all of this happens because modern history needs human evolution to follow a linear, comfortable, predictable path. An intelligent and organized pre-human species would completely destroy this model. It would show that humanity did not start from scratch, that it is not the natural culmination of evolution, but rather a replacement, perhaps even an artificial adjustment within a larger experiment. This would explain why, after the cataclysm, the Sumerians began to portray the Anunnaki as figures of almost absolute authority. They were not just spiritual gods, they were managers, engineers, supervisors for ages. They determined who lived, who died, who governed, who taught, and even what should be forgotten. If this pre-human species really existed, and if it really coexisted with the Anunnaki, its extinction and erasure would have been part of a planned process, a process that completely reorganized the planet, both physically and historically. And here comes the most disturbing part. The reason this knowledge was suppressed could have been very simple. The existence of this ancient species would reveal that humanity does not own the Earth, only its current tenant. It would show that we are not the first chapter in Earth's history, nor necessarily the most important. And for civilizations that depended on obedience, order, and belief in divine hierarchies, this would be too destructive. Humanity needed to believe that it was unique, that was special, that it had been created directly by the gods. The previous species would complicate all of this, and therefore it needed to be deleted. Modern archaeology, without even realizing it, follows this same script. When they find something that doesn't make sense, that doesn't fit into current systems, they simply dismiss it as an anomaly. When symbols suggest non-human beings, they classify it as religious art. When ancient chronologies extend over millions of years, they are said to be errors of interpretation. When megalithic structures defy human technology at the time, they attribute it to geological coincidences. But all of this collapses when we confront what the Sumerians actually said, not what they interpret of it, but what is literally written on the tablets. These boards don't lie. They speak of ancient eras, of different beings, of cataclysms that closed entire worlds, of external interventions, of reconstructions, of forbidden memories. They talk about a species that existed before us. And no matter how much they try to turn this into a myth, the truth remains, uncomfortable and persistent, waiting for the moment when someone finally decides to listen. And now that you're following all this reasoning, I want to ask you to leave a word in the comments that represents how you feel when you discover that perhaps history was shaped to hide an entire previous species. It could be something like hidden, suppressed, control, or truth. This interaction strengthens our community and helps spread these reflections that official history insists on ignoring. Let's continue together, because there is still much more that the Sumerians left hidden in the shadows. When we look at everything that has been revealed so far, the erased traces, the subtle clues, the silenced narratives, and the hidden interventions, we inevitably come to what is perhaps the most disturbing of all: how this revelation would completely change our understanding of who we are. Because if the pre-human species really existed and went extinct deliberately or catastrophically, and if humanity was shaped shortly thereafter, then the most important question is not about the past, but about our own identity. What are we really? A natural creation, a biological accident, or the result of a project carefully planned by the Anunnaki, inspired, corrected, or even based on what came before us? This question becomes even deeper when we analyze how the Sumerians describe the emergence of humanity. They don't talk about slow evolution. They talk about creation. They talk about mixing. They speak of a breath that came from heaven, of a mold remade, of a being adjusted several times until reaching the final version. And at the same time, they talk about previous beings that already inhabited the earth, and that apparently served as a reference for this process. This means that humanity can carry within itself genetic fragments of the previous species, memories, impulses, characteristics that do not belong to the original Homo sapiens, because the original Homo sapiens, in fact, may never have existed. What we call human may in fact be a hybrid, part terrestrial, part external, part ancestral, part modified. This idea, although uncomfortable, finds support in several Sumerian details. They speak of beings created with fortitude, of beings created with conscience, of beings created with obedience, and they always make it clear that these characteristics did not arise spontaneously. They were selected, they were shaped, they were tuned with purpose. And when we think about it, we realize that humanity wasn't just created to exist, it was created to function, to accomplish something, to inherit a post-cataclysm Earth and maintain it under the guidance of those who ruled it. This would explain why the first Sumerian humans already appeared with advanced notions of agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and social organization. They didn't learn this slowly. They awakened with these capabilities already installed, as if they were inherited memories or implanted instructions. And if this is true, then understanding the past is not just a historical exercise, it is an act of self-knowledge. Because if humanity has fragments of the previous species within itself, it means that we carry, at some level, the same restlessness, the same search, the same feeling that there is something beyond what we are able to see. Maybe that's why so many different cultures talk about elders, first beings, ancient masters, as if we were trying to remember something that was ripped away from us, but that still pulses in the deepest memory of our existence. Spiritual traditions around the world speak of fall of consciousness, of loss of ancestral knowledge, of barriers between worlds. And if we understand this not as a metaphor, but as a reflection of a transition between species, everything starts to make sense. Humanity is born with the feeling that something has been lost, that something is missing, that there is a void that we cannot explain. This void may be exactly what's left over from the total erasure of the pre-human species, a psychological remnant of a history we haven't been allowed to remember. But the Sumerians, by preserving fragments of this memory, made it clear that there are still enough clues to reconstruct part of this truth. And that's what makes this investigation so powerful. When we look at this puzzle with an open mind, we begin to notice signs around us that have always been there, but that we never knew how to interpret. For example, the human obsession with the sky, with the stars, with the unknown. This may be inherited from the previous species, which perhaps had a much more direct connection with astronomical phenomena, or our almost intuitive ability to build complex societies, something that appears too early in human history to be considered natural. This may be a reflection of inherited knowledge, partially erased, but still present in our code. And, of course, there is the issue of fear, the fear of cataclysms, the fear of the end, the fear of the unknown. All cultures carry this trauma in their roots. Fears so specific and so universal rarely arise by chance. It's possible that this is residual memory of a real event, the extinction of the previous species, etched into the human psyche before we even existed as a species. Our myths about floods, about destroyed worlds, about forced new beginnings may, in fact, be the distorted memory of the end of those who came before us. And if this is true, the most important question is, why now? Why does this subject return precisely in an era of technology, information, expansion of consciousness, and global questioning of ancient structures? Perhaps because, for the first time in thousands of years, we have access to the Sumerian tablets without filtering, without forced interpretation, without institutional censorship. Maybe because we are finally ready to redefine what it means to be human. And perhaps because this knowledge, however disturbing, may be the key to understanding our real purpose as a species. A purpose that has been erased, distorted, fragmented, but which still vibrates, silent, within each of us. And while you reflect on all this, about identity, origin, legacy, purpose, leave a word in the comments that represents what this awakens in you. Something like, who are we? Ancestry, awakening, or hidden truth. These interactions help our content reach more searchers and strengthen our community in investigating this ancient mystery. Let's continue to gather them, because what comes next will deepen this revelation even further. As we continue to move forward on this path that history itself has tried to block, we begin to realize that the greatest revelation lies not just in the distant past, but in the direct impact it can have on the present. So far, we have covered fragments of ancestral memory, traces of an erased pre-human species, traces of Anunnaki interventions, and a historical silence that still echoes like an invisible wall between what we were allowed to know and what was carefully hidden. But now we come to an even more delicate point, understanding how all of this shapes our perception of ourselves and why this revelation has been so feared for millennia. Because if the true history of Earth and previous civilizations were widely known, the modern world simply wouldn't be the same. When we look closely at the Sumerians, we notice something that goes unnoticed by almost everyone. They didn't just record facts, they filed warnings. They knew that their knowledge came from something much older, something they themselves did not fully understand, but recognized as an essential part of human history. This is why many Sumerian tablets carry an almost melancholic tone, as if they were trying to preserve as much as possible before the memory of the previous species was completely consumed by time. And even without saying it explicitly, it is clear that they understood that humanity carried a responsibility. The responsibility not to repeat the mistakes of the past, and to keep alive the memory that we were not, and never have been, the first. It is at this point that the narrative begins to touch a deeper dimension, the spiritual, the psychological, the existential. Because when we imagine a previous civilization destroyed, we are not just reconstructing a lost world. We are dealing with the possibility that your values, your fears, your desires, and even your failures have been transmitted to us in some way, maybe in our DNA, maybe in our psyche, perhaps in the very way we build societies. It is no coincidence that all human cultures, from the oldest to the most modern, carry the same central themes: fall, rise, destruction, new beginnings, conflict between superior beings, the need for balance, and the incessant search for meaning. All of these are shadows, echoes, reflections of what came before. And this is where one of the most important questions arises. What if humanity is, without realizing it, repeating the same cycle as the previous species? What if we are heading towards the same errors, the same tensions, the same imbalances that led to the collapse of that civilization that the Sumerians tried to preserve in the form of memory? The signs are disturbing. Our obsession with technology, our distance from nature, our inability to find harmony between people, the constant emergence of global tensions, environmental deterioration, and the feeling that there is an invisible force pushing humanity to a breaking point. Perhaps this collective fear is not just contemporary anxiety. Perhaps it is an ancient memory, an ancestral scar inherited from those who have perished before us. The Sumerians speak of eras that end when a species overcomes its own balance, when the world ceases to be able to sustain the weight of its choices. They describe the end of the pre-human species as a total, rapid, irreversible collapse. There is no room for redemption, only for survivors who witnessed the fall and tried to rebuild from the ruins. This is repeated in mythologies on all continents. Atlantis, Lemuria, civilizations of giants, underground people, cities that disappeared under the sea. All these stories, so different and yet so similar, may be fragments of the same truth. A truth that the Sumerians recorded as faithfully as possible, even though they knew that only a small part would survive. And when we think about this, a new understanding emerges. Perhaps the greatest loss caused by the erasure of the pre-human species was not the physical extinction of this civilization, but the extinction of its knowledge. If this species possessed technology, spirituality, cosmic understanding, energetic connection, or even biological abilities that we no longer possess, then its destruction also meant the loss of gigantic potential. Maybe they had answers we still seek today. Perhaps they understood the balance of the earth in a deeper way. Perhaps they understood the role of humanity from a much greater perspective than we are capable of seeing. And the Sumerians, knowing this, tried to preserve as much as possible in their records. They knew that humanity would need this knowledge at some point. Maybe right now, perhaps now, when modern technology brings us, it allows us to rediscover what was suppressed, revisit history without filters, reinterpret ancient narratives without fear of censorship, and finally question what for millennia was considered absolute truth. That's why this issue is not just historical, it's urgent. Because understanding that we were not the first necessarily means understanding that we may not be the last. And this realization changes everything. It redefines our responsibility to the planet, to life, to the future. It makes us look again at the choices we make as a species. It reminds us that the past can be a warning, and that the Sumerians left us this warning not as an antiquated reliquary, but as a warning to modern humanity. Now, before we move on to the next point of this journey, where this revelation becomes even deeper, I want you to leave a word in the comments that represents how you feel when you imagine that we may be repeating the cycle of the previous species. It could be something like alert, reflection, mirror, or path. Your interaction is essential for this knowledge to awaken more people and for this research to continue alive. Let's move forward together, because what comes next reveals even more about the true nature of humanity. If you've made it this far, it means that you're part of that small group that really seeks to understand what's behind the official story. And that's exactly why I want to invite you to continue this journey with me. So before you go, subscribe to the channel right now. This ensures that you won't miss the next chapters of this investigation, because there is still much, much more hidden in the shadows of our origin. And if you stayed until the end, I want you to comment below on the phrase, "I awaken to the ancient truth." This comment shows me that you are part of the community that truly understands the importance of this content and helps the algorithm deliver this video to more people who also need to wake up. Take advantage and leave your like now, because it makes a huge difference so that this message reaches more searchers like you. And it's not out of the video yet. The next episode is appearing on the screen now. Click on it and come with me to delve even deeper into this mystery that the Sumerians tried to leave us with as a warning. Let's go together.